Emily Ferris, thank you so much for speaking to us. This example of little green men that Bruno Carl talks of, he mentioned specifically Estonia. Just talk us through, what is that example? What are little green men? What is he exactly warning about?
Well, this is a very specific example that refers to the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. So what happened at that time was that, it's often referred to as a bit of a bloodless coup, in the sense that it was staged very carefully, in a very considered manner, and you didn't see a sort of a mass kind of military gathering, and lots of bloodshed. And what did happen was the appearance of what they refer to as little green men, but also sometimes they're referred to as polite people. And these were men without specific insignia on their uniforms, and they sort of started to appear around Crimea. And obviously, people had their suspicions that they were, linked to the Russian armed forces, and they were speaking Russian, and people made their inferences. But what that did do was give Russia a sense of what they like to call plausible deniability. So it was very easy for them to say, well, actually, this had very little to do with us, and that it wasn't something that was kind of state sanctioned. But obviously, of course, it was. So I think what's being referred to here is the idea that Russia might consider doing something similar along those lines, where you don't see such a blatant military assault, but you see something, I suppose, a bit more creeping.
And what would Russia be testing in this scenario with NATO?
Well, obviously, it's a bit speculative at the moment to talk about specifics, but what I would say is, if you were to see a scenario that it's really probing defences, if you're using a small contingency of, let's call them soldiers for the sake of this, what this is really about is trying to see how NATO responds to things. But what I would say is that, Crimea was a very unique set of circumstances. I don't really see a repeat of that happening again. But certainly, Russia has significant interest in probing NATO defense systems, trying to see where their weaknesses are, both on land, sea, and air. And Russia's intelligence penetration and intelligence interests in the Baltic states are really significant.
Talk us through, why don't you think that this is likely?
Well, there's a couple of reasons why. A Russian land invasion of the Baltic states carries with it significant risks for Russia. The first is obviously, the use of Article 5, the fact that NATO would consider that to be an attack on all. Then there's the sort of practical costs. So if Russia is going to learn anything from the Ukraine war, and I think it is going to, I think the Kremlin is kind of considering what rearmament looks like and how it's going to account for some of the very serious demographic problems, at least trying to build up its armed forces again, if the casualty rates are to be believed in terms of the sheer numbers. I think it's going to have to consider whether the next war that it fights, is it going to be such a thing as a sort of clumsy land invasion, or is it going to have, and this is probably my view, is Russia going to invest more deeply in things like political technologies? So trying to influence, particularly, say, the Baltic states, Georgia, countries from the former Soviet Union that Russia thinks it's got a sort of privileged sphere of interest in. Will it try to use some of the not insignificant resources that it has to try to push political opinion in those countries towards a pro-Russia stance? There's lots of things that could look like, that could be not necessarily just installing a pro-Russia leader, but making enough parties so that a coalition includes a pro-Russia voice, or expending significant resources on I was going to say military, but no, on a media campaign that would try to move, say, public opinion closer to views, say, that chime with Russia. And Russia certainly has the resources and sort of the financing to do that. And I can certainly see that would be a more targeted approach in the next few years.
Let's return to the example that Bruno Carl talks about, and we'll come on to some of those other tests in a moment. Surely the idea of little green men only works with the element of surprise. Otherwise, you end up with sort of open shooting, you can imagine, in the streets.
Well, absolutely. In the situation with Crimea, I suppose, one can talk about whether that was a surprise, because actually it was something that the Russian State Duma, so the lower house of parliament, were talking about even weeks ahead of the annexation. It was something that they passed a law against, in which they recognized Crimea to be Russian territory. Although I suppose you would probably have to be watching Russian political processes quite carefully to be able to see that. It wasn't particularly blatant. And yes, of course, it's a far cry from saying things in parliament to actual military takeover. So it was a surprise, I suppose, in the sense that it was a very daring operation that took people by surprise. But absolutely, that this sort of sense of readiness is something that the Baltic states have been preparing for a long time. It's something they talk about a lot. It's featured in all of their national security doctrines. Russia is identified as their major security threat. I mean, I think that Russia is certainly interested in the Baltic states. I don't really believe that Russia has territorial designs on the Baltic states in the way that it does on places like Ukraine and Belarus. It's just a different way of thinking about the countries. And Russia's foreign policy is quite varied according to which country you're talking about.
Is the idea with Russia to spark a conflict with NATO, which seems like, as you've described, quite a possible outcome if this were to the route it were going down, or if it is not seeking conflict, what is Russia seeking? What's the sort of upper limit of the confrontation Russia is willing to stomach with NATO?
So it does seem like Russia is searching for a conflict. I can see that based on the things that they say and the things that they do. I don't necessarily believe that Russia is interested in an all-out war. So if you look at, say, the response in Russia to something like the Strategic Defence Review that was published last week in the UK, that talks about Russia as a really pressing security threat to the UK. Then there's the need for increasing military spending, all of this. Russia's response to that has been kind of a mixture of derision, because that's kind of the way that Russia tends to have a bit of a contradictory narrative about what they think about the UK. A bit of derision, but also a little bit of caution. And I can see a lot of voices in Moscow that are very cautious about, say, some of the wording where we're talking about a preparation for a future war with Russia. Some of Prime Minister Starmer's words have been slightly misconstrued in Russia, which I think is even more concerning. It could be a sort of lost in translation, but also I think there is a real sense from Moscow that the UK and like-minded countries like France and Germany in the European Union are considering significant amounts of rearmament in the next few years, pivoted directly against Russia as the main security threat. So I guess it is important to think about how Moscow understands what they perceive to be a threat towards them. Not because we necessarily agree with that perspective, but the way that I suppose our defense policies are being worked on are sort of reflective of their actions and vice versa. So I think that Russia has sort of stopped short of things like the nuclear option. Every time there's been a sort of situation where, according to some of their defense doctrines, that would be grounds for the use of nuclear warfare. They've walked that back. So I don't really believe that they have a sort of zero-sum game when it comes to the relationship with NATO. Where will they stop is a really good question, because actually I don't think anybody understands what Moscow's red lines truly are. They seem to be moving consistently through the war. That's the only thing that has been consistent as far as I can tell. Their territorial demands have moved. The war aims have been revised down and changed. What they want from the West is a little bit difficult to understand. It's a little bit nebulous to say that they want sort of respect and acknowledgement, and it's hard to quantify. It's very difficult to understand what it is, and perhaps that's because it's not really clear to the Russians either what they actually want in material terms from us. So here we have a situation where we're sort of talking past each other, things are lost in translation, and nobody's goals are particularly clear about what we want one from the other. That in and of itself, I think, carries with it a degree of danger and scope for misunderstanding, and therefore escalation, perhaps unintentionally.
Let's touch on some of the other tests which Russia might throw at NATO. You've spoken already about what you call political technologies and strategies to try to undermine other democracies or install more pro-Russian leadership. What are some of the other tests, if not little green men in Estonia, as Bruno Karl says? What are some of the things that NATO should be looking out for that Russia might use to test Article 5 or other elements of NATO's willingness?
Well, there are things that Russia's doing already, which is probing air defences, these sort of close brushes with European airspace. That's to kind of see how quickly jets can scramble in response. So that's a useful piece of information for Russia. There's certainly a lot of activity in terms of, maritime, submarine information gathering. So I think information for Russia is very important about the way that NATO armies are, that NATO powers armed forces are sort of configured, some of their potential vulnerabilities. So I think a greater degree of attempts to, I suppose, recruit from the civilian population intelligence operatives is certainly something to be kept an eye on. But I think that's something that the Baltic states are very alive to. I think that threat is very well understood, and it's something that they do take significant measures to counter. There's I suppose, the sort of softer power of things, but a lot of the Russian organizations that are linked to the Kremlin, that are sort of, cultural centers and things, have been a little bit restricted from operating, because it is well known that they are often sort of a bit of a foil for intelligence activity. But then there's the sort of private business aspect. There's plenty of Russian business interest in the Baltic states that's very difficult to understand, say, the beneficial ownership of certain companies, lots of different sort of shadowy companies with offshore accounts. So that still exists, and it's very difficult to trace that. It's another way of Russia sort of pushing influence and also being able to make a bit of money out of the Baltic states. But if we're focusing just on the Baltic states, I mean, I think that, Russia is relatively limited actually in what it can do, because if we assume that there isn't sort of a likely military option, politically, what the Baltic states do tend to do is try to keep these pro-Russia parties out of government, and they've actually quite successfully done that. And it's those parties' links with United Russia, which is Putin's party, are relatively well known. It's open on the internet. It's not clear, for example, whether they receive a particular amount of funding, whether that means they're able to do certain things, but certainly their views and opinions are not widely held. It doesn't seem like they've got a huge amount of power. So I would say, for now at least, Russia's ability to influence or manipulate the Baltic states into doing something that is, beneficial to Russia for the moment is quite limited.
Perhaps a note of optimism there. But what does passing these tests look like for NATO? What is a sign of success in Bruno Karl or Mark Rutte's book?
So I suppose probably a state of high preparedness and anticipation for something like this before it becomes a little green men scenario would probably be a sign of success. So what happened with, the assault on Kiev was the exercises, the military exercises between Belarus and Russia were used as a pretext to gather troops in Belarus. And from there, they launched the assault on Kiev from all sides. So, things like gathering of troops on the border. I know that probably sounds a little bit obvious, but perhaps something a bit more, and I am speculating here, say significant construction of railway systems in that part of Russia, because Russian land warfare is still conducted using its railway network. It's very difficult to move anything heavy, really, so tanks and anything, without using railway systems. And if you saw, say, a significant investment going into construction of railway systems near the border, like they did with Ukraine. This was something that, after the annexation of Crimea, there was significant investment in the south of Russia to link up a lot of its military bases, and that made it a lot easier to move troops around during the war. So if you saw something like that, and that looked like it was preparing for a sort of long-term conflict to try to move troops around Russia with the view of mounting an assault on the West, that would be something that you could look for in a tangible way. But as I said, I think aside from very subtle signs, it would have been quite difficult, I think, in 2014 to have anticipated Crimea would happen perhaps quite in the way that it did. Perhaps not the whole thing was a surprise in and of itself, but I think the manner in which it occurred itself was, I think, quite surprising for most leaders at the time.
Interesting. I suppose that preparedness is probably what Bruno Karl is wanting from this warning. Emily Ferris, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.